The linen before us appears luxurious. Crisp, fine, maybe even Egyptian. But look closer. That sheen, that pale cream color, is merely a thin varnish over centuries of neglect and intimate biohazard. What we are calling the king's quilt was never just bedding. It was an archaeological record, stain after foul stain, holding the condensed history of human existence under royal luxury. This was not rest. To sleep here was to negotiate with germs, and often you lost. The concept of a clean environment, as we understand it today, simply did not exist in the medieval keep. The accumulation of bodily waste, sweat mixed with accumulated grime, menstrual blood, battlefield grit, all found their way onto these seemingly pristine surfaces. Everything was damp. Everything smelled faintly, profoundly of accumulated life and decay. Imagine a deep slumber, undisturbed for hours, only to wake up feeling the unsettling knowledge that every cell on your skin had been in prolonged contact with something unsanitary, something historically hazardous. It wasn't just poor plumbing, though that was certainly part of the picture. The sheer density of living beings concentrated within stone walls meant that waste management was a constant, overwhelming problem. Privilege did not confer immunity from filth. It merely elevated the asterisk type asterisk and asterisk density asterisk of filth. Royal bedrooms were places where different categories of medieval life, the scent of expensive imported spices mingled with sour urine, the metallic tang of poorly cleaned weapons mixing with sweat, all struggled to coexist in the same air, on the same breathable space. The bed itself was a multifaceted trap. It wasn't merely a place to lie down. It was the epicenter of multiple intersecting, unsanitary systems. From the mattress, which absorbed every kind of fluid, to the heavy woolen blankets and quilts designed for status display, everything contributed to a single, vast, damp biohazard layer. The accumulated particulate matter, dust mingled with skin flakes, animal dander from bedding beasts or decorative furs, and pollen trapped over seasons, formed a thick, invisible tapestry of biological threat. Deep within these layers lay the evidence of centuries, mold spores breathing in the dark corners, mites feasting on dead human detritus. Consider the ritual surrounding these materials. Linen was prized because it could be bleached, theoretically cleaned, and reused endlessly, a crucial commodity in a time when anything valuable had to last. But washing merely addressed the surface level. Deep cleaning required methods that were either unbelievably laborious or simply dangerous. Boiling everything enough times to eliminate true pathogens was impractical. Instead, they relied on airing out, smoking, and occasional harsh scrubbing with substances that might themselves be irritating or toxic. The result was a cyclical process, temporary superficial cleanliness followed by inevitable, deeper contamination. The sheer weight of expectation settled over the royal bedding. Every breath taken upon it was recorded by its residue. A king slept not merely on textiles. He slept atop a compressed timeline of everyone who had come before him. Every illness, every seasonal dampness, every casual bodily accident, a physical palimpsest of human indulgence and decay. And this sets the stage for something far more unsettling than just germs. Because if sleep was inherently hostile territory, a biologically compromised space, then the act of staying awake became not merely an option, but a tactical necessity. It transformed simple rest into a profoundly risky political calculation. The contaminated bed, therefore, was symbolic. It represented vulnerability. To relinquish consciousness in that toxic cradle was to surrender control to chance, biology, and those who sought to exploit your unconscious state. It taught us immediately that for the medieval elite, sleep was not restorative. It was a profound relinquishing of sovereignty. They were always sleeping in a hostile environment, surrounded by filth, history, and potential biological warfare agents. And this fundamental incompatibility between natural rest and political danger would define every moment that followed. The first chapter taught us that the king's bed was not merely a place of rest, but a sophisticated biohazard. But to focus solely on the linen, or even the mattress, is to miss the far deeper rot beneath. We must confront what truly underpinned medieval life, the complete lack of advanced waste management. Forget plumbing as we know it. Forget indoor sanitation systems that kept nobles distanced from their own biological fallout. In the densely packed keeps and stone castles where these great houses resided, human habitation was perpetually entangled with its own refuse. Our proximity to our sewage, both visible and invisible, was not a mere inconvenience. It was an existential contaminant that shaped everything from fashion choices to political strategy. Imagine this reality. Life lived in the shadow of accumulated filth. The latrines themselves were often simple, deep pits or channels running along walls, directly connected by gravity and by stench to living quarters. This meant that waste, all forms of it, be they fecal matter, urine, or even the contents of a discarded wash basin, was part of the immediate environment. It was not something relegated to an outhouse field. It permeated the structure itself, seeping into the very stone and wood where comfort was expected. And when we consider sleeping arrangements, those cramped keeps that defined noble life, the shared infrastructure became terrifyingly intimate. The concept of private bodily waste management simply did not exist for most people of power until well into the modern era. This meant that sleep, the presumed period of solitude and rejuvenation, was played out against a backdrop of communal biological necessity. When plumbing was inadequate or simply non-existent in the places where true power resided, noble proximity mandated a disturbing level of overlap. The dreams were literally shared, if not through a common drain pipe connecting multiple privy areas beneath the floorboards, but by merely occupying air that carried the scent and residue of others' bodily processes. The sheer physical constraints magnified every potential danger into a political threat. To share a latrine was one thing. To sleep within walls whose drainage systems were visibly porous or adjacent to living quarters that shared waste runoff was something else entirely. Rest became an act of forced intimacy with decay. Every creak in the floorboard, every rising damp odor, spoke not just of poor masonry, but of human consumption and expulsion played out beneath your very pillow. This proximity turned hygiene itself into a matter of extreme political vulnerability, a sickness originating from contaminated waste, a simple intestinal infection that modern science might dismiss as mere bad plumbing could escalate in the medieval court to an accusation of divine displeasure, or worse, subtle poisoning. Contamination was not just biological, it was ideological. If your lord fell ill with symptoms traceable back to impure living conditions, the cause could be easily twisted from a failing drainage system into a deliberate act of contamination by a rival faction. The implication was damning. They were suggesting that even your deepest rest was corrupted by your enemies. The accoutrements of sleep became thus loaded with symbolic meaning. A perfectly clean pillow, or one protected by elaborate ritualistic changes, suggested purity, a rare commodity in an era where the ground beneath you might be doing its best impression of a swamp. Conversely, poor hygiene could not only signal poverty, but also suggest spiritual impurity, making the sleeper vulnerable to accusations of sorcery or divine disfavor. This constant entanglement with shared waste management forced a level of uncomfortable public performance. Even in private moments, you were always aware that your bodily functions, the most primal aspects of existence, were part of the collective environment. There was no private dream because the plumbing and the general atmosphere made everything communal. The ultimate danger lurking beneath the surface of royal slumber wasn't just a simple common cold. It was the accusation of treason built upon an unsanitary foundation. If your rest was compromised by what others expelled, your very personhood, your natural state of being, could be questioned and dismantled in the name of purity or stability. The physical act of living together, confined within stone walls with limited sanitation resources, created a high-stakes environment where illness was inevitable. Suspicion was rampant, and every shared breath seemed to carry the risk of a lethal germ. Sleep, far from being a sanctuary, became merely another precarious point in this continuous negotiation with germs, waste, and deadly political scrutiny. It was an exhausting, unsanitary crucible, forcing even kings to become masters of perpetual vigilance against invisible contaminants, whether they emerged from the gutter beneath their floorboards or from the whispers of rival courtiers. Sleep in the medieval court was rarely a gentle affair. It was an interruption, a necessary but fraught vulnerability that played out between the sheets and the lethal politics of the keep. After navigating the biohazards of contamination and the acute physical pressures of shared living quarters, we now enter the realm of biochemistry. Rest, for the ruling class, could no longer be defined purely by dirty linen or cramped stone walls. It was increasingly defined by what entered their bodies, and more specifically, what might force them into a slumber too deep, too compliant. The most obvious element of medieval rest is simple seduction, the promise of quietude. But where luxury meant access to exotic and potent pharmacological ingredients, the danger deepened from mere filth to active chemical interference. We are moving beyond merely unwashed bodies. We are talking about deliberate alteration of consciousness. This chapter explores the sinister trade in slumber, the herbal mixtures, the dream-inducing drafts, and the powerful sedatives that marked a nobleman's final hours. To understand the threat, one must first appreciate the pharmacopoeia available to the sickly rich. These were not the standardized medicines of our time. They were wildly potent concoctions, often built around plants whose medicinal properties were intertwined with their ability to alter mood, perception, and physical state. The court physician, armed with a book of lore rather than pure science, was simultaneously the most trusted confidant and the greatest threat. His skill lay in creating balance or deliberately disrupting it. The herbs employed varied wildly depending on the desired effect. Were they meant to calm a restless spirit suffering from melancholia, perhaps using roots believed to soothe the humors? Or were they intended to induce a dream state conducive to revealing secrets? The line between a therapeutic sleep aid and a truth serum was agonizingly thin, especially when motivated by treasonous suspicion. Many sedatives, for example, relied on potent mixtures involving opium poppy derivatives or nightshade. While these could certainly quell feverish anxiety or allow a king plagued by insomnia to achieve deep rest, they carried an immense risk. Overdose wasn't just passing out. It was crossing into the unknown territories of near coma or outright poisoning. The preparation of these mixtures itself became a political act. A simple tea meant for calming nerves could be subtly altered, perhaps with an undetectable agent that fostered compliance, making the subject deeply trusting and perhaps more susceptible to suggestion upon waking. The careful ratio of leaves, bark, wine, and mineral elements was knowledge held in the most restricted circles, granting immense power to those who understood it. This brings us to the pervasive shadow of witchcraft. In a period where illness, sudden behavior changes, or an unexpected susceptibility to sleep were often blamed on supernatural influence, pharmacology became indistinguishable from dark magic. Any strange herb, any unexplained lethargy could be interpreted through a lens of occult failure. A nobleman suffering from what we now recognize as anxiety might find himself treated with remedies described by local folklore. Tinctures using seemingly random combinations, perhaps incorporating parts of dubious animal anatomy or minerals of unsettling origin. The cultural misunderstanding here is critical. The potent alkaloids that interact with the nervous system were viewed through a spiritual, not chemical, lens. The sedatives were thus bundled up with charms and curses, making it impossible to trust the source of comfort. Was this sleep-inducing draught genuinely healing, or was it merely an elaborate chemical net designed by rivals? And then there is the problem of potency, exceeding medicinal utility. Some substances were psychoactive in a way that blurred the lines between dream and reality. The goal might not have been to simply put the noble to sleep, but to give him an experience, a night spent traversing unreliable emotional landscapes where genuine memory loss or suggestion could occur. To be chemically manipulated while supposedly resting was perhaps the pinnacle of political helplessness. This created a scenario where true rest was perpetually suspect. A man who slept deeply and peacefully was not merely recovering, he was potentially compromised. Was his deep, drug-induced slumber evidence that he was either gravely ill and thus incapable of ruling, or that he had been successfully drugged by his enemies? The medicinal process became indistinguishable from the espionage procedure. The ultimate consequence is a profound paranoia surrounding natural rest. To sleep deeply meant relinquishing control, allowing one's mind, governed by potent herbs and foreign chemicals, to wander through territory unknown to oneself. For lords and kings who had lived their lives centered on constant vigilance, this was an existential threat more immediate than any physical guard. They were fighting not only assassins with daggers in the dark, but chemists with cauldrons of dubious tinctures. Thus, achieving true sleep meant submitting one's very consciousness to a process that could be controlled, corrupted, or weaponized by anyone who understood its delicate chemistry. The dream state ceased being personal reprieve and became a highly contested battleground where the only difference between restful unconsciousness and drugged incapacitation was often merely the flavor of the accompanying potion. In the preceding chapters, we examined rest in its most disgusting and perilous forms. We learned that a nobleman's bed was not a sanctuary of slumber, but rather a sprawling biohazard zone, rife with accumulated filth, shared disease, and unspeakable biological waste. Sleep itself, therefore, was less an act of rejuvenation and more a desperate negotiation with the pathogens surrounding you. We advanced from environmental decay to chemical threat. Sedatives were not gentle lullabies. They were potent, politically volatile cocktails, sometimes incorporating dubious herbs, sometimes even parts of exotic animals. To sleep in those circumstances meant surrendering control, making the dream state itself an unbearable political liability. And when we spoke of proximity, we found that basic hygiene was a weapon that could be wielded by rivals, transforming mere sickness or lingering filth into solid grounds for accusation and treason. But even surviving the germs and the drugs required constant vigilance from those who watched over you. The reality deepened when we focused on confinement. When suspicion settled upon a royal figure, their sleep was immediately stripped of all pretense of privacy or ease. It became an enforced performance, a living exhibit under the unwavering, predatory gaze of their guards. The concept here is one of total psychological and physical enclosure. Forget luxury linens. In the keep, comfort was the first thing to be excised. Every detail of your sleeping existence was rendered public domain, even if only to the handful of men responsible for your containment. You were monitored from above, along the length of the curtained bed, and discreetly from all angles surrounding the chamber. The guard's vigil extended far beyond merely preventing an attack. It maintained a comprehensive scrutiny over every natural bodily rhythm. They watched not only the appearance of violence, the sudden lurch awake, the defensive gesture, but the subtle indicators of compromise, the shallow breath that suggested a fever, the overly deep slumber that might indicate a drug's efficacy, or the restlessness hinting at a secret communication taking place in the dark. The cramped quarters heightened this tension exponentially. The architecture of power demanded proximity, forcing an unnatural closeness between the confined noble and their watchful captors. There was no corner to hide your distress. There was nowhere for fatigue or fear to manifest quietly. You could not simply fade away into sleep. You had to remain present, even when unconscious. This state transformed the natural process of rest into a grueling ordeal of psychological endurance. Imagine the weight of those eyes that never blinked fully in the deep night, eyes accustomed to seeing too much and betraying nothing. They were trained observers, their vigilance fueled by political loyalty, suspicion, or perhaps simply paid obligation. Every movement, every shift beneath heavy blankets was calculated and logged within the minds of these keepers. Consider the physical reality. A bed that was often built for restraint as much as rest, sometimes chained to prevent escape, sometimes merely positioned in a spot that allowed maximum surveillance from the surrounding chambers or battlements. These were not beds designed for dreams. They were sleep apparatuses designed for incapacitation and control. The consequence of this relentless observation seeped into the deepest levels of rest itself. It bred an almost paralytic anxiety. When you know every inhale, every sigh, is a potential piece of evidence against you, your body cannot relax into true vulnerability. The mind remains in a state of high alert, subtly disrupting the natural architecture of sleep cycles. Sleep becomes fragmented, punctuated by micro-awakenings, the need to assess the surrounding threat level, the compulsion to listen for sounds that might suggest an incoming danger, or worse yet, the approach of one's true enemy disguised as a friend. The body adapts, not towards deep REM recovery, but towards shallow, hypervigilant cycles. This oppressive environment made simple rest impossible, leading to chronic fatigue and psychological strain far beyond what is associated with mere lack of sleep. It was the mental taxation of sustained threat. Any period of perceived peace, a momentary lapse in a guard's watch, perhaps, was seized upon immediately by suspicion. A slight change in demeanor could trigger an immediate escalation in security protocols, and that brings us to the insidious conclusion that under the keeper's vigil, sleep itself became another arena for political struggle. The ultimate betrayal might not come with a dagger plunge during the day. It might arrive when you are theoretically safe, while passing out from exhaustion, allowing your rival, or worse, an outside agent, to administer the perfect dose of drug, or simply wait until the moment of utmost vulnerability to deliver a fatal blow. The keeper's vigil ensured that for royalty, true oblivion was a luxury they could never afford. Every slumbering hour was merely a temporary pause button on an endless drama of survival, surveillance, and high-stakes betrayal. It confirmed that in the world of medieval power, even closing your eyes carried profound political cost, even when the sheets were technically clean, even if they smelled of generations of sweat and political anxiety. Rest was never a truly private act. Sleep became, instead, an inherent vulnerability, a passive surrender that exposed one to dangers far more insidious than mere physical contamination. If basic hygiene was compromised, then silence, the kind that allowed secrets to surface unvarnished, was the ultimate currency of treason. This brings us to the art of the silent snitch, or perhaps the inescapable confession whispered in the velvet blackness of a shared keep room. The supposedly safe sanctuary of sleep offered no immunity from the court's constant vigilance. The mind, even when exhausted and drifting toward oblivion, was still prone to revealing knowledge. And secrets, unlike germs, could not simply be scrubbed away or sealed beneath layers of beeswax polish. They tended to bloom, whispered on damp sheets in the dark. In the cramped quarters of a castle keep, where every breath felt measured against the chill draft from the battlements, and every object served dual purpose, decorative relic, and potential weapon, sleep became a communal performance. You were not merely resting, you were performing an act of temporary negligence before eyes both visible and invisible. The greatest threat wasn't the plague rat nesting in the rafters, nor the inevitable fungal bloom on the damask bed hangings. It was the person lying next to you, the rival whose seemingly deep slumber masked a calculating alertness, the trusted confidante whose murmurs of comfort held the poison of dissent, or even the hapless servant entrusted with stoking the embers near your head. Consider the intimacy forced by proximity. With shared bathing facilities and cramped communal sleeping arrangements, personal space was an extinct concept for the medieval lordling. If you slept in close quarters, the barrier between private rest and public surveillance dissolved completely. The whispers didn't necessarily have to be spoken. They could be implied by a slightly too long pause during the night watch's routine patrol, or by a shared glance that held more meaning than any explicit declaration. These were not the grand, dramatic seditions of history books, the poisoning at feast, or the ambush in the muddy courtyard. The betrayal was often silent, enacted in the vacuum of late-night quiet. It was the overheard disagreement whispered into a pillow, the subtle change in bedding that signaled absence, the murmured question posed during a fitful period of wakefulness. The tapestry itself, the magnificent, woven representation of lineage and power hanging on the wall, became a silent confession booth. Every knot and thread represented established order, yet it could not contain the unpredictable messiness of human ambition. These tapestries absorbed more than light. They seemed to absorb sentiment, fear, and unspoken accusations. The physical artifacts of sleep became evidence. Did a certain piece of personal jewelry shift just so, catching the faint moonlight in a way that suggested recent interaction? Was the wine goblet placed on the bedside table slightly off-center, implying an unexpected visitor or hurried departure? These seemingly meaningless domestic details were catalogued by those who considered gossip to be statecraft. The art of the silent snitch was mastering the appearance of restful oblivion. It meant developing a deep capacity for benign feigned sleep, a perfect stillness that allowed one to observe and absorb everything happening around you without acknowledging it. To appear deeply, peacefully asleep was not merely self-preservation, it was the ultimate political shield, rendering the sovereign momentarily invisible to both enemy eyes and manipulative whispers. But even this illusion could fail. A slight cough that sounded too loud in the cavernous silence of the keep. An itchy night requiring a sudden, furtive movement. These biological failures were interpreted by the suspicious mind not as natural discomfort, but as signs of guilt or weakness, the unmistakable tremor of one whose loyalties wavered even during their deepest, most unconscious slumber. The weight of constantly being scrutinized transformed rest into an agonizing exercise in discipline. Lying down was a strategic failure. One had to remain mentally coiled, alert enough to detect the shift of footfalls on the stone stairwell, sensitive enough to decode a single muttered phrase from across the chamber. Sleep became less about recovery and more about maintaining perfect, suspicious stillness. This cycle taught them that in the high-stakes game of medieval power, the only truly private moment did not exist. Every breath taken, every limb resting upon a biohazard quilt, was ultimately under observation. The darkness itself held witnesses, making even dreams themselves politically dangerous territories ripe for interpretation and weaponization by those who slept less soundly than one might wish to admit. The political theater of the medieval court was already a grueling performance, lasting from the first dawn skirmish to the deepest night watch. But if one were to survive that day, they faced an equally menacing challenge: sleep itself. In these halls built for power and intimidation, rest was never merely biological necessity. It was a profound diplomatic crisis. The concept of slumber, in theory, suggests withdrawal, a temporary retreat into self-preservation, but the medieval court understood this better than anyone. Sleep did not offer sanctuary. It created predictable weakness. A king who slept deeply could be accused of indolence, suggesting military neglect or spiritual fatigue. A noble who seemed overly refreshed might be seen as careless, inviting disaster upon his peers. The vulnerability inherent in sleep was thus immediately weaponized by courtiers and rivals alike. If you wished to accuse a rival of treason, the most potent accusation was not usually about a failed battle, but about the quality and manner of their repose. Were they too tired, too rested? Was their breath even? These seemingly trivial details became acute markers of political instability. Consider the sheer physical burden of maintaining power in an era defined by precarious authority. Every noble lived with the constant tension that a misstep, a cough heard at the wrong moment, or a perceived lack of alertness could cost them everything: their lands, their titles, and their lives. Sleep demanded relinquishing control. Treason required absolute vigilance. This fundamental conflict permeated every corner of royal life, and history is littered with records demonstrating how often physical health translated directly into political currency. A reported illness, or even just the necessity of a few extra hours spent recuperating after feasting and drinking, could be interpreted as divine displeasure, suggesting that the favor of heaven had turned against the ruling house. The body became an open book written by court rivals. This scrutiny extended far beyond mere accusations. It affected the very protocols of life within the keep. From the bedtime rituals to the length of the morning wake-up call, everything was viewed through a lens of suspect intentions. If the king appeared merely lethargic, his legitimacy could be questioned by ambitious viceroys or disgruntled cousins waiting for the moment of perceived weakness. The danger wasn't just what happened during sleep. It was the asterisk perception asterisk of sleepiness itself. A suspicious lord might accuse a rival of purposefully inducing fatigue, suggesting a slow poisoning through an innocuous drink meant to cloud the mind before making the fatal blow. The very act of feasting and socializing, rituals designed to cement alliances and project wealth, was inherently exhausting, creating natural troughs of biological depletion that rivals were trained to spot. Imagine the psychological pressure. You must appear constantly alert, perpetually ready for confrontation or diplomatic entanglement, while your body is fundamentally programmed for rest. This created a state of chronic, adrenaline-fueled exhaustion. The noble was never allowed the luxury of true repose, because in medieval society, peace was synonymous with decline. The stakes of good sleep were nothing short of life and death. A comfortable bed, an uninterrupted slumber, could imply that the dangers outside were sufficiently managed, thereby making the sovereign too complacent or weak to rule effectively. This forced paranoia became a silent undercurrent to every court banquet, whispered over wine, and breathed out in the damp stone chambers. The investigation into rest then becomes less about hygiene, which was horrifying enough on its own, and more about statecraft itself. Sleep is not just an act of biology. It is interpreted as a barometer for governance. If the queen sleeps through vital counsel, she is seen as useless. If the king oversleeps after a perceived threat, he is seen as timid or susceptible to manipulation. This acute political awareness meant that even supposedly therapeutic rest had to be managed with incredible discretion and paranoia. When was it acceptable for a royal figure to withdraw? How long could they remain in private quarters without being watched? The answer always involved complex negotiation, often necessitating the presence of multiple guards and attendants, whose loyalty and potential bribery was constantly under question. The simple luxury of deep, unscheduled sleep became an actionable piece of evidence. It meant one was withdrawing from political life, tacitly accepting a temporary loss of control, which was treasonous in itself. Thus, maintaining the facade of perpetual readiness became more important than any actual period of rest. The royal body had to perform endurance, turning the necessity of deep slumber into an act of profound and dangerous defiance against a court that demanded nothing less than total wakefulness. Suspicion by suspicion, until death claimed them all. We have journeyed through the biological nightmares of contaminated linens, traversed the shared anxieties of sanitation systems that blurs the line between private decay and public crime. We discovered how chemical sedatives transformed restful sleep into a state of dangerous dependence. But even after surviving the bed, the bodily waste, and the drugged nightmare, the court still demanded its rituals. What did it mean to simply rest in the presence of absolute power? It was not enough merely to be sheltered. One had to perform the proper ritual of stillness. Our focus now shifts from the filth of the sheets and the poison in the drafts to the elaborate, often baffling customs that governed the very architecture of slumber. These were the rites performed around the headboard, designed less for comfort and more for control. Superstition and statecraft were not opposing forces here. They were inextricably linked by threadbare linen and palpable fear. The bed itself was not merely a place to sleep. It was a focal point for all of life's anxieties. It represented vulnerability, the ultimate surrender of will. And in the eyes of medieval nobility, vulnerability was a political sin. Therefore, every aspect of the sleeping space, the placement of the wardrobe, the selection of the pillows, the positioning of even the curtains, was laden with symbolic weight and practical dread. A king did not just sleep, he performed sovereignty while unconscious. The sheer physical reality meant that good luck charms were mandatory elements of statecraft. If your rest was to bolster your reign, it had to be visibly reinforced by protective rituals. This started with the headboard itself. These structures were often ostentatious displays of wealth and piety, serving as miniature architectural declarations of power. They declared, "Here lies a man whose sleep is sanctioned by God and thus protected from lesser men." But these grand statements often masked deeply superstitious concerns. The medieval mind was intensely animistic. Dreams, in particular, were viewed not as random firings of neurons, but as literal conduits to the spirit world, or perhaps worse, as battlegrounds for hostile ethereal forces. A bad dream was not merely unsettling. It could herald a plague, betray an enemy's movements, or signal divine displeasure that could easily translate into peasant rebellion and civil war. Therefore, protecting the sleeper from psychic attack became an urgent function of state stability. The king's peace required his sleep to be sacrosanct. These protections manifested in bizarre and often uncomfortable rituals designed to ward off bad fortune. Imagine bedding adorned not only with expensive silks, but also with protective knots or specific herbs placed strategically to deter malevolent spirits. Some documented accounts suggest the burning of smoky incense during the deep night was required, believed to purify the air and dissuade unseen spies, whether they were demonic entities or simply rival court whispers taking physical form in the drafty keep halls. These rituals forced an unnatural vigilance on the populace, turning rest into a monitored spiritual event. But the superstition did not operate alone. It intertwined meticulously with political necessity. Consider the concept of warding off treason. If a lord was suspected of harboring guilt or plotting rebellion, his bed, the very site of profound unconsciousness, became the primary locus for suspicion. The accusation wasn't merely about what he did while awake. It was about what rested undisturbed beneath the covers. Could his sleep be interpreted as apathy? Was his exhaustion proof of moral decay? Any lapse in ritual or any apparent physical discomfort could be spun by a rival into evidence that he was compromised, spiritually unsound, and therefore politically unfit to rule. The herbs used were often fascinatingly dual-natured. While some botanicals genuinely possessed medicinal properties, used perhaps to soothe restless limbs or combat the pervasive damp cold of stone keeps, many others were incorporated purely for their symbolic resonance. Sleep might require sprinkling specific graveyard dirt on the mattress, not because it cured nightmares, but because certain local folklore dictated that only soil consecrated by ancient death offered true protection against living enemies. The sheer effort required to maintain this highly formalized nightly routine suggests that belief systems provided a vital structure of stability. If the rituals failed, society believed the very foundations of the dynasty might collapse. Furthermore, the arrangements themselves spoke volumes about status and trust. A king sleeping under guard in an armed chamber was not simply secure. He needed his personal space to visually manifest his supreme authority, even in slumber. The headboard area became a symbolic representation of his inviolability. It had to look impenetrable, richly decorated, declaring that his right to rest, and by extension, the state's right to function, was beyond challenge. These ritualistic elements, therefore, illustrate the deep collision between inner spiritual life and outward political reality. To be truly restful was almost a treasonous luxury. It suggested detachment from the continuous struggle for power. The nobility had to maintain a constant, performative state of alertness, even when they were in the deepest sleep. Their bed rituals were an architectural manifestation of this required performance. I rest peacefully, therefore I am stable, my dreams are blessed, therefore my reign is divinely sanctioned. The ritual of the headboard was thus more than decoration or divine defense. It was a carefully constructed piece of political theater played out in the dark. It demanded resources, expensive incense, complex carvings, rare medicinal plants, and required the adherence to specialized knowledge that only trusted servants and court scholars possessed. This created an information imbalance. Knowing how to correctly maintain one's bed rituals became a subtle marker of loyalty, as inaccurate performance could signal weakness or worse, carelessness in the face of political scrutiny. The rules governing sleep were as demanding, complex, and threatening to survival as any battle decree, and it is this persistent realization that even unconsciousness was nothing more than another highly policed battlefield that leaves us on the precipice of analyzing what happens when that fragile state of rest is deliberately shattered. The catastrophic cost of deep slumber itself This understanding transitions us to a far more dangerous contemplation, one where perfect tranquility becomes the greatest threat imaginable. Throughout the preceding chapters, we have traced a breathtakingly disturbing map of medieval rest. We've journeyed from the literal biohazards of contaminated bedding to the chemically compromised quietude of drug-induced slumber, recognizing that in the castle walls, nothing, not even sleep, was ever clean or passive. We learned that the most private moments were inherently political moments. And now we arrive at the culmination of this dread, the sheer vulnerability represented by deep, restful sleep. This is not merely about getting enough hours. It is about the profound loss of control itself. In an era where consciousness was your primary shield and your alertness your ultimate currency, to surrender to slumber was to become a breathtaking political liability. The medieval lord's deepest repose did not equate to security, it equated to dormancy. And in the viper's nest of court life, dormancy was suspicion's finest fuel. The deep sleeper was a dangerous figure, not because they were incapable of rest, but because when they were rested, they surrendered every visible advantage. They lost their watchfulness, their quick wit, and most critically, their immediate capacity for deceit. For the powerful noble, perpetual alertness was not just a habit, it was an architectural necessity of survival. To sleep deeply was to admit a weakness that rivals, and those more intimately aware of your vulnerabilities would be obligated to exploit. The greatest danger lay in the intersection of physical vulnerability and political suspicion. A man who looked genuinely rested, whose skin had not been marred by lack of rest or fear, might simply be deemed too powerful, too settled into his station. Stability was suspicious, and if instability could be suggested through sickness or contaminated sleep, then deep rest became the ultimate confirmation of that suspected ailment. Consider the implication. The court did not tolerate simple fatigue. It tolerated calculated exhaustion. It demanded performance. The nobility lived under a permanent state of hypervigilance, a ceaseless, draining masquerade where every moment was a possible scene of betrayal or discovery. The threat wasn't just that you might need to sleep. The threat was what your slumber signaled to those watching from the shadows. A deep, unshakable sleep suggested two things: either complete confidence in the current regime, which invited resentment from disaffected parties, or a genuine physical decline, an ailment which political enemies could interpret as signs of enfeeblement and waning bloodline. This is where the sedatives, examined previously, take on an entirely new weight. When one was chemically coerced into slumber, they weren't merely losing consciousness. They were performing the perfect act of impotence, the ultimate tool of treason. They lacked the power to recall incriminating words, or even to physically resist a command. Their deep sleep was not recovery, it was incapacitation. orchestrated by rival hands through dubious herbs and careful chemistry. Furthermore, the very rituals designed to protect rest often became tools for surveillance. The protective wards placed around a noble's bed, the cleansing smokes, the uncomfortable arrangements of lucky charms, the obsessive monitoring of bedtime routine were just as much about managing public perception as they were about warding off malevolent spirits. They broadcasted, "I am here, I am secure, but I must labor to prove it." This visible commitment to performance was exhausting and inherently suspicious. The deepest terror lay in the quiet moment of falling asleep. That fragile transition from wakeful paranoia to unconscious oblivion represented a complete surrender of sovereignty, the sovereignty of self. The guards slept poorly, fueled by suspicion and adrenaline, knowing that while they were guarding your body with their physical presence, their vigilance could be bought off or distracted, and the rival noble did not need to storm the room. They merely needed to plant a seed of doubt, an overheard murmur, a discarded letter found under the pillow, suggesting that even in sleep you were plotting against them. This dynamic forces us to confront the paradox of power. True strength required permanent, restless motion. Rest was not a right. It was a temporary reprieve granted at enormous political cost. A lord who appeared too peaceful might be accused of slumbering on perceived slights, a subtle implication that they had lost their guard and perhaps their soul. Consequently, the ideal medieval ruler did not rest. If exhaustion was inevitable, it had to be presented as the natural consequence of governance, visible enough to show the weight of his duties, but never profound enough to suggest collapse. Sleep had to remain a tightly managed, ritualized event, always underscored by an air of strained vigilance. It could not afford to be deep. The price of deep slumber was therefore twofold. It meant physical incapacitation, ripe for chemical exploitation by rivals, and it signaled a perceived loss of political will, allowing enemies to advance their claims while the noble was momentarily unaware. Sleep did not mend them, it exposed them. It turned the sanctuary of the bed into the ultimate stage for accusations, turning dreams themselves into matters of state security. Thus, we conclude that within the suffocating confines of medieval court life, rest was never truly restorative. It was always a high-stakes act of political performance, a fragile ceasefire between the burdens of power and the inescapable threats of betrayal. To sleep deeply was to consent to suspicion, making slumber not a period of peace, but simply the next phase in treason's devastating, ceaseless wake. We have spent chapters navigating a terrifying landscape of rest, examining how the medieval nobility managed to survive, let alone function, within beds that were less places of sanctuary and more biological hazard zones. We've seen that sleep was not an escape from life's dangers. It was merely another high-stakes arena where secrets could spoil, health could be manipulated, and sovereignty could crumble. In the modern imagination, we view sleep debt as a medical inconvenience, a mild fatigue requiring adjustment, perhaps cured by a weekend retreat and a few extra hours in a darkened room. But for those who lived through the clatter of accusation, under the scrutiny of wary courtiers, or within the stifling confines of an unsanitary keep, the concept of adequate rest must have been nothing more than a cruel joke told to a civilization that fundamentally misunderstood survival itself. The modern understanding of sleep is predicated on comfort, cleanliness, and predictable biological functions. We design our lives around 8 hours of deep, undisturbed slumber. Yet, when you strip away these modern comforts, the sealed glass windows, the flushing plumbing, the sterilized linens, and transplant us back to a 12th century lord's chamber, all sense of peace evaporates. Sleep debt then ceased to be an athletic concern. It became a profound political and existential liability. To rest was to become physically vulnerable. To sleep deeply was to concede control. The great medieval sleep debt debate is perhaps the most ridiculous intellectual exercise we could engage in today. It suggests that if only they had eaten better or used herbal poultices for their itching bedding, they might have achieved optimal physical performance while ruling a volatile state. But history resists such neat footnotes and easily resolved problems. The truth was far messier, darker, and ultimately incompatible with the notion of restful peace. Consider the accumulation of threat. You are struggling to survive in contaminated linens that harbor countless pathogens. You know your neighbors share every drop of water and every petard privy. Your own rest might be tainted by potent psychoactive drafts intended either for care or chemical subjugation. And above all, you live under constant suspicion. Every bodily function a cough, a fitful adjustment in the night, a deep sigh of exhaustion becomes suspect evidence. The nobility did not manage sleep debt. They managed *risk*. Their entire nightly routine was a carefully orchestrated, exhausting performance designed to project stability and unshakable vitality. To appear rested meant you were powerful. To appear merely tired suggested negligence or decline, whispers that could lead directly to accusations of treason, civil unrest, or divine disfavor. What we gain from studying their sleep is not guidelines for better pillow placement, but a chilling realization about the absolute fragility of power. The deepest threat was never the invading army. It was the quiet, unguarded moment when consciousness faltered. The court required perpetual performance. They were expected to embody vigilance day and night. This relentless demand created a society where exhaustion itself was considered an act of poor governance. A monarch who looked weary might be interpreted not merely as ill, but as spiritually depleted or physically weak, a signal to rebellious vassals that the line of succession was vulnerable. And so, the prevailing myth we carry today, The idea that one can simply sleep off a problem or recuperate through enough downtime is fundamentally flawed. For medieval rulers, deep slumber did not equal recovery, it equaled surrender. It was the temporary forfeiture of one's greatest asset, active awareness. The struggle was thus perpetual. The body demanded rest, but the crown demanded alertness. This tension formed a constant, agonizing loop that permeated every aspect of elite life. Sleep became less about restorative physiological function and more about risk mitigation, making the entire bedchamber an extension of the political battlefield. We are left with this uncomfortable conclusion. There was no optimal way to sleep for a medieval lord. There was only the minimum amount of compromised, highly monitored rest required to prevent visible collapse, coupled with enough paranoia to keep one on edge while even trying to achieve unconsciousness. Their nights were not restful. They were strategically managed periods of temporary suspension, forcing them into a constant state of high alert, the very definition of unsustainable tension. The legacy we draw from this chaotic era is one of profound vigilance. It forces us to view the simple act of closing our eyes with a newfound dread and appreciation for its assumed safety. For those who governed under suspicion, sleep was not a gift. It was the most dangerous commodity they possessed, a period when their defenses lowered, and treason waited, silent and watchful, in the shadows night had passed. The darkness that had seemed to guard the nobility through deep slumber was suddenly betrayed by a cold, inevitable gray creeping over the stone battlements. Dawn arrived not as a gentle curtain call, but as a sudden, brutal spotlight throwing all failures and vulnerabilities into sharp relief. The temporary cessation of conscious thought, the supposed sanctuary of rest, snapped shut, revealing the terrifying continuation of reality. For the medieval courtier, waking up was never an act of repose. It was simply the instantaneous resumption of high-stakes performance. If sleep had been a pause button on life, dawn's dread was the jarring, violent re-engaging of the machine. The first moments were characterized by profound, visceral disorientation, a confusion compounded not just by chemically induced slumber or poor bedding, but by the knowledge that one's vulnerability had been exploited during the hours of unconsciousness. There was no gentle stretching and slow sip of tea. There was an immediate sensory assault. The scratch of rough wool against skin, the acrid smell of unwashed stone mixed with smoke and stale fear, and the relentless demands of dawn itself. The transition from the biological anonymity of sleep to the sharply defined roles of court, the lord, the rival, the servant, was jarring. A person who had surrendered their will to slumber was immediately reminded that they were still entirely subject to the whims, whispers, and gazes of others. The body's simple act of waking up became a political statement. Did one rise too quickly appearing sluggish? Was there an undue delay, suggesting incapacity? In any case, every movement in the early hours was scrutinized by eyes trained for betrayal. The ritual of rising itself was dangerous. A noble must present not just himself, but the careful facade of enduring power and vigor. Fatigue, even simple physical tiredness, resulting from traversing filthy bedding or sleeping under excessive watch, could be interpreted as a profound failing in duty, suggesting that one lacked the necessary internal fortitude to rule. This forced perpetual state of near alertness created a unique form of sleep debt, a conceptual exhaustion that was not merely biological but existential and political. The great lesson delivered by dawn is this: rest never truly absolves you of your responsibilities, nor does it grant immunity from suspicion. The moment the eyes opened, the reckoning began anew. Any perceived weakness, any lingering shadow of a drug-induced daze, or an itch from prophylactic herbs, became immediate evidence for those with malicious intent. Consider the physical environment at first light. Where the previous night offered temporary biological respite, a state where one was fundamentally inert and unthreatening, the dawn brought back the stench of reality. The accumulated grime, the stale waste systems still venting their invisible miasmas, the visible wear on textiles that spoke of endless tension rather than luxurious life. The physical filth did not lift with the sun. It merely seemed to become more acutely noticeable, harder against the fragile veneer of dignity. The court was a place where even the simplest biological function was politicized. A cough at dawn might be interpreted as the first sign of consumption, and therefore incapacity. An excessive yawn could be seen as disinterest in state affairs. The natural rhythms of life, the need for deep breath, the slight grogginess of waking, were perceived through a lens of political suspicion, making genuine human vulnerability an actionable intelligence for rivals, and so the cycle repeats. Night offered only controlled oblivion or chemically induced weakness. Day demanded tireless, unsustainable vigilance. There was no period of neutral existence. Every phase was a high-stakes negotiation with decay, be it biological, chemical, or political. The nobility learned to perform wakefulness. They mastered the art of appearing perpetually ready for conflict, incapable of being pinned down by exhaustion, suspicious, or simple humanity. The ultimate consequence of this ceaseless performance was a deep and pervasive state of low-grade terror, a quiet dread that settled into the bones, refusing to be washed away even by the morning light. It was the realization that life within the castle walls, under the weight of royal expectation, was not measured in passing days or restful nights, but in sustained acts of suspicion management. The sleep debt wasn't just muscle ache. It was a deficit of trust. To simply live among kings and rivals meant to be perpetually suspicious, eternally ready to rise from slumber into conflict. forever on the razor's edge.